and to acknowledge that we meet on Crown land, upon which is built the Anzac Memorial, dedicated to the servicemen and women of New South Wales who have served in war and other conflicts. Welcome. I'd like to begin by inviting my friend and colleague Sid Cole to recite a poem of remembrance.
Well, it's beautiful to see such a good turnout and so many well-dressed people. Thank you for turning up today. It's a beautiful Sydney day to be out here, I think. Paul's asked me to read a piece of poetry and I'll probably glad on to do it. So I'm going to read An Irish Airman Foresees His Death, which is written by W.B. Yeats. Most of the poetry, as you probably know, that's my interest, I guess, is the literature of the First World War. Most of the poetry written in the First World War is set on the Western Front, simply because over the 4 years, that's where most personnel served. As we've put a focus on Gallipoli today, I've chosen a piece of poetry that could apply to any theatre of war. The flyer described in this piece of poetry actually died over the Italian front. An Irish Airman Foresees His Death was written in 1918 by an Irish poet, W.B. Yeats, a magnificent writer but a non-combatant, and one not normally included in the genre of war poets. It's a very short piece, so I'll offer a brief context which might help us to appreciate better all that this verse expresses. Yeats here is speaking in the persona of a pilot serving in the Royal Flying Corps. The monologue tells us succinctly what the man feels about loyalty, patriotism, and his motives for fighting in this war. The poet's insight allows us to understand the emotions that we speak of, particularly his attitude to death. The voice in the poem is that of Major Robert Gregory, who was a close friend of Yeats, and like the poet, a Protestant and a member of Ireland's upper classes. Despite this, his allegiance lies with the ordinary working people of his local village, Kiltartan Cross, most of whom would be Catholic. Many Irish people enlisted at the beginning of the war because they thought it was part of Britain, part of the Empire. But the Easter Rebellion of 1916 and the subsequent execution of a number of the ringleaders drastically changed public opinion and lost Britain the allegiance of many loyal supporters. By the time this piece of poetry was published in 1919, Yeats had become a fervent Irish nationalist and surrounded himself with people who held similar beliefs. The poet has used the concept of balance twice in the last few lines, an indication that Gregory, the flyer, has seriously weighed up his options and decided that the lonely impulse of delight that drove him is worth all the possible consequences that would surely follow his part in the war. I think the poet gets us inside the mind of the pilot, a man he admired, yet he allows us to indulge our own assessment of his character. An Irish Airman foresees his death. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. My country was Kiltartan Cross, my countrymen Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss, or leave them happier than before. No law nor duty bade me fight, no public men nor cheering crowds. The lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath, the waste of breath the years behind. In balance with this life, this death.
lest we forget. There's some very good people here today. I'd like to welcome Ian Faulconbridge and Andrew Dunlop, who will be speaking to us today about their ancestors. They are here as grandsons. Also, we have a member of the Gallipoli Association from the United Kingdom here today. And I'd like to especially welcome Debbie Copeland here and declare her as an ambassador from the United Kingdom. And I note that we have two distinguished members of the Royal United Services Institute in New South Wales, Brigadier Alan Murray and Colonel Joe Matthews here. Very good of you to be here to show support. We have members of the Amazon Friends of the First AIN. We have members of the Western Front Association in Australia. Indeed, Sid, who you have met and recited the poem, is my co-vice chairman. And we work together for that branch of the Western Front Association here. There are also members from the Australian Society of World War I era historians, including myself for that matter, James Odenford. There are other people that I know from historical societies, from shared love and commemoration of nurses. Welcome to you all. We will have an afternoon tea at which we will draw the raffle prizes, and our event should conclude at approximately 3:30 p.m. I have a very liberal approach with questions. If the mood is right and it suits, you can, I'm sure that the speakers will accept questions after their presentations, but there may be an opportunity to be a little less informal. Welcome. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. I'd like to introduce Ian Faulconbridge, who was born and raised in Brisbane. He joined the Royal Australian Air Force in 1987 and served as an electrical engineering officer on that stalwart bomber, the F-111 aircraft and associated systems for nearly 11 years. After leaving the RAF, he spent some time in industry and as an engineering academic at the University of New South Wales, teaching subjects such as radar, avionics, and systems engineering. He formed his own engineering consultancy about 20 years ago and continues to work full-time in that capacity, supporting defence industry and government. He is here today because he recently discovered that his three great uncles all served in the Australian Imperial Force, including two of them at Gallipoli, which is important in this 110th year of the commemorating the campaign. This discovery came as a complete surprise to Ian and kicked off a family research journey that he is still on today. The arrangements for Ian to come here were arranged through the United Kingdom.
That's right, yeah.
Who nominated you following your contact with the Gallipoli Association. He wears the tie and the badge of the Gallipoli Association and is currently a prospective member. It's good to see you and Anne here today. Very good of both of you to come all the way, I think, from Canberra.
Yep.
Please welcome to the podium my colleague, Ian.
Thanks, Paul. I just might get you to give me a hand with this, Paul.
Yeah, I'll just bring that up.
Good on you. Thank you. Well, I'm actually going to break with tradition and go away from the podium because everyone who knows me tells me I've got a very loud voice, and so you probably don't need it amplified. But I've got some spotters in the back corner over there who are the furthest away from me. So if I'm not speaking loudly enough, Anne can let me know. Yeah, can everyone hear me okay? I can get louder. People tell me I yell.
No, I can hear you beautifully.
Good on you. I also carry my mobile phone with me at the start of presentations to remind myself to turn it off. So I don't really care if your phones ring, but I don't want mine to ring. So for what it's worth, I've turned mine off. Paul, thank you very much for the invitation. Where's Paul gone? There he is. Thanks very much for the invitation to come and give this presentation. I'm very excited to be here. It's a beautiful venue, and I'm looking forward to telling you the story. I need to caveat my presentation with the fact that I'm not an historian. I'm not an expert on Gallipoli. I'm not an expert on any Australian operations in the First World War. What I am is someone that, as Paul said, about 12 months ago, was taken by complete surprise, having stood on maybe 40 Anzac Day ceremonies in my life, wishing that I had some sort of direct connection with the meaning of the day, to find out as a 55-year-old that some of my direct relatives served at Gallipoli and beyond. Just came as a complete surprise. And I think it was to me very important. I'll tell you the story about how I found it and why it's important, rather than jump ahead in my presentation. So what I'm going to talk about today is how that discovery happened, and how, in my view, it's a very close thing to the history of these men being completely lost from my family's knowledge. So I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the learning journey that Paul spoke about that I've only just commenced. So there's much more I don't know than what I do know. So you'll have to forgive the lack of some of the detail in today's presentation. I'd like to talk about what the discovery has meant to my family, and what I'd like to do in the future with regards to continuing my journey. There's a lot of stuff that I want to continue researching and learn a bit about. Paul told me that there was a Q&A afterwards, so I've stuck that on the slide as well. There could be a lot of Q's and not a lot of A's, but you can have a go. So this is where it all kicked off. About 18 months ago, my father went through a whole series of medical issues. 89, 90-year-old man, in and out of hospital. Ended up on his way to a nursing home. Mum and Dad have lived in the house in Brisbane that I grew up in for over 60 years, a big house. And we're now faced with the daunting task. My mum's 85 years old. The daunting task of tidying that place up and getting it ready to sell, so that my dad can be looked after in a nursing home and my mum can be looked after in a more manageable accommodation. So that was the setup. I was visiting Brisbane periodically during that period of time, helping Mum clean up the house. And we were cleaning up a room that we generically referred to as the office, which was basically a massive room in the front of the house, was just chock full of paperwork. It wasn't really an office, but that's what we called it. And I came across that postcard, to Mum with love from George. And I said to Mum, First World War soldier, who's George? And she said, oh, that's my uncle, your grandfather's brother, George. And I said, well, what's the story with George? Where did he serve? When did he serve? What did he get up to? Mum said, I don't know really very much about it, other than the fact that he won quite a significant gallantry award at some point. And so, that's what kicked things off. And she said to me, there's more than George. So she started to explain to me how the family tree worked. Now, I don't know whether family trees put you to sleep or not, but there's not too many of these, so bear with me. But George is sitting up there. I've highlighted him in red, and you'll see that I keep showing his picture throughout this presentation in red, so that you can tell who I'm speaking about. But George, sitting up there, the eldest son of Mary and George Senior, I guess you could call him, and quite a few children. Thomas, William, poor little William died as a 3-year-old, Fanny, Clifford, and Stanley. And you can see the dates there. I was born in 1969, so you'll be able to see that I did not meet George. I did meet Thomas, and I did meet Clifford, and there was zero talk about what they did. So I remember meeting them as a young boy, but absolutely no idea what they got up to. I'm going to tell you what they got up to today. I never met my grandfather, Stanley. In fact, I'll just move the family tree a little bit up here so that you can see where I sit, down the bottom here. Stanley was my grandfather. Never met Stanley. He died in '56 when my mum was quite a young girl. Married to Marjorie, my grandmother, who I obviously knew. My uncle Rodney, who also served in the RAAF as an engineering officer, and not coincidentally on F-111s as well. It's where I got my passion and interest from. My mum, my 3 sisters, and me. So you can see that George is my great uncle. So that's how the family tree works out. But anyway, I was talking to Mum about it and asking her a bit more about these guys here, and she dug out some more photos. She dug out a photo of Thomas dressed in his uniform, highlighted here in light green so that you can tell the difference between George and Thomas. And she also dug out a picture of Clifford in uniform. And so that's what kicked off my journey. I want to know what the story is with these 3 men that 2 of whom I met, but I knew nothing about. So that's what today's presentation is about. It's about those 3 individuals and what that discovery has meant to my extended family. So what I did was I contacted a guy. I'm not sure whether people in the room might know Neil, but I contacted Neil, and Neil gave me a hand to dig up a whole bunch of research on the 3 brothers. The richest research is on George, because George won some significant awards during his service, and he also spent a lot of time in hospital, unfortunately, as a result of some of those actions. And he had the same regimental medical officer all the way through. So the medical records are very, very complete for George. So here's George. He was born in Williamstown, which is on the outskirts of Melbourne. He was an electrician by trade, and his medical records indicate that he was quite a tall man for that vintage. So, you know, a shade under 6 foot tall, getting up to 70 odd kilos, and described in his records as having, you know, fair complexion, blue eyes and brown hair. Probably a description that was the same for most of the young men that joined the army, maybe, I don't know. But I think he looks pretty good in his uniform, and these are the only 2 photos that I've got of George. So you've seen my complete record already. Yeah. So George joined the RAF in 1914 and was attached to the 2nd Field Artillery Brigade. Left Australia, or left Melbourne actually, more correctly, on Shropshire. I get these names mixed up. Which was a ship that was carrying about 800 odd soldiers and 400 odd horses, and it headed from Melbourne across to Albany. Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot. I got some pictures of the ship. It doesn't look terribly inviting to my eye, but that's what George travelled over to Egypt on. Now this slide here is a lot of words. But I just want to talk a little bit about some of the numbers on this slide, because otherwise these numbers can kind of just, you know, be numbers on a page. George's ship went across to the Western Australia, and joined a flotilla of 41 other ships, which in my mind is a massive number, right? In fact, it's well reported. You can look it up in the Western Australian papers and you can see some of the details. The convoy left Australia in 1914 carrying 17,000 Australian soldiers and 10,000 New Zealand soldiers. Does anyone in the room know how many soldiers there are, full-time soldiers there are in the Australian Army today?
33,000.
Yeah, there's about that. The numbers have been revised down a little bit, but around that 30,000 mark. So today we have 30,000 soldiers in the Australian Army. 17,000 of them were on those ships collectively. Let's not forget about the Kiwis. Does anyone know how many full-time soldiers are in the Kiwi Army at the moment? 4,000. About 4,500. So you've got a flotilla that's carrying more than twice the number of soldiers that are currently serving in New Zealand Army, and more than half of the soldiers that are currently serving in the Australian Army. Phenomenal numbers, aren't they? Anyway, this looked like it was a pretty exciting journey on its own before they got anywhere near Gallipoli, because the authorities were worried about the threat of German warships attacking the flotilla. With numbers like that, you can imagine that that'd be a good thing to be worried about. And in fact, that became a reality when SS Emden started sniffing around the flotilla, and it was engaged by HMAS Sydney. It's an aside. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I've done a reasonable amount of work at HMAS Watson, just over in Watson's Bay, in one of my professional capacities. And at HMAS Watson are some of the original charts out of HMAS Sydney of that engagement with SS Emden. It's quite a well told story. So, you know, George was on his way to war, but there were quite some significant side stories going on with respect to, say, the Royal Australian Navy's involvement and things like that. So I thought that was quite a kind of a cool piece of information. I drew this map to basically try to tell my family, explain to my family the significance of this journey that this guy was on. They left Melbourne, they went to Albany, they hooked up with those 41 other ships. They headed towards Colombo. Halfway along there, they got, they were threatened by that SS Emden, and Cocos Island was where SS Emden ended up, run aground by HMAS Sydney. They went up and ended up at Alexandria and then down into Cairo, where they did their training. From Cairo, they headed into this little black rectangle here that I've blown up over here. Started off at Lemnos and then landed at Gallipoli. So George landed at Gallipoli on the 25th of April, which, you know, just blows me away that I didn't know that. A bit of a chronology of George's time at Gallipoli, from what I can gather. He spent an extended period of time fighting there with the headquarters of the Field Artillery Brigade that he was associated with. He spent a bit of time back on Lemnos as a rest period, about 3 weeks, I think, and then went back to Gallipoli in October. On the 30th of November, George was seriously wounded in an incident that eventually won him a Distinguished Conduct Medal. And he was also mentioned in dispatches because of that action. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. He was evacuated from Gallipoli about a few weeks before the Australian withdrawal, and he ended up in the General Hospital in Cairo. In fact, I haven't got the details here in the slides, but he ended up, from what I can gather, being in that particular hospital for a period of time, and they must have had a hierarchy of hospitals that once he was out of the woods, he went into different types of hospitals in different locations. So he didn't spend all of his time in that hospital. Once he was out of the woods, he went to other places in Egypt. So apparently on the 30th of November, what happened was communication lines had been cut through some sort of artillery action between his headquarters and where they were communicating with, probably individual gun positions and things like that. And it happened at around Lone Pine. George apparently left cover and ran out to the location where the communication lines were cut. And I'm an electrical engineer, so I can imagine what these communications lines would have been like, and I can imagine what they would have been like as in this situation. So there would have been series of twisted pairs or pairs of wires, and it would have been like a rat's nest of if you cut one of those cables. If you cut it properly, it's neat, but if you blow it up, you end up with like a literal rat's nest here and a rat's nest there, and you've got to try to work out which wires to connect to which. So that's what George was trying to do. Reports say that he was shelled. He and a colleague were shelled about 75 times during his time out there. His colleague was killed. George was seriously wounded. The reports say he was thrown up in the air a number of times, buried completely, eventually rendered unconscious with head injuries, fractured skull, significant injuries to his upper legs and buttocks. Not sure how he got back to safety, whether someone went out there and dragged him back or whether he managed to crawl back, but he got back to safety, and he was looked after by this guy, Dr. Whitford, who, as I referred to earlier, remained the regimental medical officer all the way through, and is able to paint a fairly bleak picture of George and the aftermath of this incident on George's physical and mental well-being. George was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. It was promulgated in the London Gazette in 1916, and this is what it said. So you can read that. So a pretty amazing story that of poor old George. So he's now back in hospital in Cairo. Well, when this was gazetted, he wasn't in Cairo anymore. He was on the Western Front. But so that amazes me as well. You know, a guy's blown up, fractured skull, rendered unconscious, has zero memory of this incident for well over 6 months. They patch him up in Cairo and send him to the Western Front, and off he goes. So he went to the Western Front. You're going to have to forgive my pronunciation of these locations in France. So I've used a map just in case my pronunciation is so bad that you can't understand it. But he ended up on the Western Front by April 1916, and from what I can gather, he served primarily in this big box here around Villers-Bretonneux. He had 5 months of instructional duties. I'm not sure whether they gave the soldiers a little bit of a reprieve by moving them into alternative positions during this extended period. I don't know, but he ended up in Normandy for a few months as an instructor. He didn't stay there for long though. He went back onto the Western Front, and he stayed on the Western Front until 3 days before armistice. So George was at war from the first day till 3 days before the end, and he headed back to England on the 8th of November in 1918. He was mentioned in dispatches a second time in France. Must have been a good soldier, I think. And he was also awarded the French Republic's military medal during that period of time as well. So yeah, pretty amazing story for George. He came home in early part of 1919, and he was discharged in March of 1919. I don't have George's medals. I haven't seen the originals, but last year, before last year's Anzac Day, I got a set of replica medals made. In fact, I brought them because Paul put pressure on me that this was a show and tell. So I brought the replica set of medals with me today. I'll leave them on the table if people want to have a look.
Just hold them up.
Do you know what the originals are?
No, I don't. This is one of my TBDs. I'll get to some of my TBDs in a second. But you can see the DCM on the left-hand side. The highest medal runs on the left-hand side there. You can see the traditional 3 medals for someone with George's background. The oak leaf indicating that he was mentioned in dispatches in the Australian award system, even though he's mentioned in dispatches a couple of times, he only wears a single oak leaf. And the foreign medal is considered subordinate to the Australian medals and sits on the right-hand side, regardless of how significant that medal is. So that's George's pretty impressive cluster. So I'll put that on the table over there, and people can have a look at it and you know, original medals. Although, interestingly, I need to work out how long I'm talking for. This one is an original. The French military medal is an original medal because in Australia, the Australian replica medal factories don't make French military medals. So I actually bought that medal from a guy in France and sent that to the guy that was making the rest of the medals, and he put it together for me, which I appreciated. After the war, George didn't fare so well after the war. As I said to you, the medical records indicate that he lost memory of the incident for an extended period of time. Suffered from pretty significant anxiety. Maybe today we'd give it different labels. And he also increasingly lost his hearing over a period of time. He was in and out of hospital in Victoria. He didn't work full time beyond 1930 and died in 1962. So despite all of his injuries and his history, he did live quite a long time. And I visited George's grave a couple of months ago, so I know where it is, and yeah, it's good to know. Let's go back to that family tree. So that's what George was up to, but you'll notice that Thomas was only a couple of years younger than George, and Thomas is also wearing a uniform. So let's have a look at what Thomas got up to. Thomas, not quite as big as George. He enlisted in late 1914 and was assigned to the 13th Light Horse Regiment. He departed for the Middle East on my birthday, 28th of May in 1915, and headed through the same sort of process that George went through with regards to training, and then on to Gallipoli. He was at Gallipoli for a period of time. I don't have any indication to know whether he and George crossed paths at Gallipoli. They were there, but at the same time for a period before George was wounded and evacuated. And Thomas stayed at Gallipoli until the Australian withdrawal in late December. He also headed to France after that, and he, interestingly, requested and was granted a transfer to the 2nd Field Artillery Headquarters, which is George's unit. So when he got to France, he joined George's unit. The historian that I've been speaking to said that during that period of time, that was allowed by the Australian authorities, but you'll see that in a year or so, the Australian authorities worked out that wasn't a good idea, and so Thomas didn't spend very long co-located with George. But he fought in roughly the same sort of area that George fought as a result of being in the same unit. He suffered dysentery. It must have been a fairly serious incident because he spent an extended period of time in the UK in hospital, and then came back to the front in December of 1916, stayed there until June. June 1917, Thomas was transferred out of that Field Artillery Brigade to a different unit, and we think that this was around the time that the Australian authorities didn't want brothers serving in the same unit because they were wiping families out in single actions. So Thomas moved and spent some time up north around Menin Road and Mezins. He was wounded in action during this period of time. Again, it must have been reasonably significant issue for him because he was gassed and spent quite a few months over in England recovering from that. Again, just because you go to hospital for a few months after being gassed didn't seem to cut too much slack. So he was back again and saw action around up to and including the advance on the Hindenburg line. He stayed there until the war was finished and spent a few months in England before heading back to Australia in mid-1919, and he died in 1980. And again, I've visited Thomas's grave, which is only about 200 metres away from George's grave. How am I going for time? Because I've got it.
You have plenty of time.
Okay. How I found their graves is an interesting story, and it relates to what you spoke about earlier, Paul. Because of all of this stuff that I'm finding, I go to Anzac Day ceremonies most years. I thought what I'm going to do is I'm going to get myself a Gallipoli Association tie, and that will be what I wear to Anzac Days. So that was my plan. So I contacted the Gallipoli Association. I looked at the website. I saw that I could buy a tie. I purchased a tie, and now I'm communicating with someone in England about my tie. And I told them, oh, I'm buying the tie because of this. And they asked if I could send a couple of photos, tell them a bit of a story. They put it on Facebook. Yeah, no worries, there you go. There's some pictures, there's a bit of a story. They put it on Facebook. Now, in this day and age where most people, I think it's easy to think that most people don't care about anything. Everyone's a bit nasty, everyone's a bit self-centered. This thing on Facebook, it turned up on Facebook and I looked at it, and this guy in Melbourne, I don't know him, this guy in Melbourne posted a picture of George and Thomas's grave. He said he's seen it, he's read the story, and he wanted to pay his respects. So that's how I found them. Pretty nice, isn't it? Total stranger. Here's Cliff. Cliff was a bit late to the story. He joined in 1918, mid-1918, so you can tell where this is going to end. He ended up in the 15th Light Horse, and he headed across to the Middle East in September of 1918. He got there, by the time he got there in October, he was only there for a few weeks before hostilities with the Turks ceased, and all hostilities ceased. So Cliff got there and didn't see, luckily for him, didn't see some of the things that George and Thomas saw before him. And he ended up back in Australia in the second half of 1919 and died in 1989. He's not buried in the same cemetery as George and Thomas, and I haven't been to his grave. It's a bit further away from where they are, but I will get there.
Ben, just interrupt you there. Don't stop your research on him, because 15th Light Horse was involved in putting down the Egyptian rebellion in 1919.
Okay.
So you might need to look at that.
Okay. Thank you. What's all this achieved? Well, here's a picture of me and Mum at Anzac Day in last year. You can see Mum's looking pretty proud. She's wearing George's medals, and so I think that this discovery of these men has allowed me to put a picture together and distribute it to my wider family, so that the memory of them is going to live on. And so I think it's been a really good thing for our family. It gives us all a really strong sense of meaning at Anzac Days and Remembrance Days. Last Remembrance Day I was thinking, how relieved would my great-grandparents have been on that day when 3 of their sons are overseas. Must have been a big day for the family. there's a lot more that I need to do. As I said, I'm very early on in my learning journey. I need to understand a bit more about what those men got up to after they came back to Australia. I'm vaguely aware, and I'm vaguely aware of the extended family tree. Thomas was married but didn't have any children. I'm not sure whether that was due to issues with his injuries. But George did have a family, and so did Cliff. So I'm on that kind of thing. I'm hoping that somewhere in Australia there's some George's and Cliff's great-grandchildren or someone like that who've got the originals of his and got more photos and got maybe some diaries, maybe they've got some letters. So I'm kind of on that very early stage of trying to find those people and seeing whether they're interested in connecting. No, I'm a bit wary about having my DNA done.
Well,
You know what the lawyers say, you shouldn't ask questions you don't already know the answer to. So
No,
yeah.
she's just guiding you. That's one way to find out
Yeah.
about all the family.
I've got their names, so I think I can find them.
And the thing with doing DNA, can I just say, is that what you think is a lot of the time isn't anyway.
Yeah.
There's lots of surprises.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
of them good.
Yeah.
Some of them good.
Yeah. No, I'll have a think.
But you will find your family.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah. Okay. Not. I don't want to open a can of worms here, but there is another can of worms, because I've discovered something else in my family tree by doing this research. All of these boys that I've been speaking about today are on my maternal grandfather's side. On my maternal grandmother's side is a guy called Thomas Swinburne. Thomas Swinburne was in the Australian Flying Corps in France. Thomas Swinburne's transferred to the Royal Australian Air Force when the Royal Australian Air Force was formed. I think his service number was A19, so the 19th potentially guy, member of the Air Force, and he died in 1940 as a group captain. So I'm starting to find out a little bit more about him, but there's a lot of interesting stories that come out of the woodwork when you start digging into these things. So that's where I'm at the moment, and that's where I'd like to finish. Paul, in finishing, I'd really like to thank you, Paul, and all of the people who've come along today for giving me the chance to share the story in such a nice venue. I've covered a fair bit of territory in a pretty rapid time, but yeah, I hope it's been of interest to this group. And Paul, I appreciate your invitation.
Thank you, Ian. You know, it is so serendipitous that you bought that tie.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
so serendipitous that you then established contact with the Gallipoli Association.
Yeah.
I had just become the chairman of the chapter here, ostensibly Australia, but I was demoted to New South Wales ACT quite quickly. And then I established contact with you, and then I found out about Andrew, and I said, what we've got to do is have a meeting, because the story that you have told is the story of many people and several people who are here. I am going to ask for questions, but I have a first one, if I may. I'm sure that the citation for George's Distinguished Conduct Medal mentions 9.2-inch shell fire causing his wounds. Of course, the 9.2-inch gun was aboard the battleships of the Royal Navy.
That's right.
Is it possible that he was wounded by friendly fire that terrible day?
Yep, that is one of the things that they suggest could be the case. Yeah. Yeah.
Because the direction of fire straight to that position was very easy from the sea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to present you with this copy of the New South Wales Government's history of that state in the Great War. With my compliments and that of the Gallipoli Association.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you.